So basically, I'm going to give you a sense of what I experienced when I went around interviewing all of these elders, as well as a number of offenders and some support workers over the course of those 6 weeks. I'm going to take you through this story through my eyes. So this sort of session is about what I saw and how it changed me. I'm not purporting. I'm going to let the elders eventually tell their own stories, because that's not for me to tell. I'm not going to speak for them in any way. But I'm going to tell you what I learned, and I'm going to do that through talking to you about it, but also showing you some clips that changed me as I was going through this process. I started the journey by going to Moncton, and one of the first people I met was Sarah Anala, who is an Inuit elder. She works in Dorchester. She works with Inuit offenders. She drinks Pepsi out of a can, and she smokes harsh hand-rolled cigarettes that she buys at that she buys at the local band reserve. She shared one with me, and it was the first and last one I ever had from her. She's a wonderful person. So when they first come in contact with you, and you're speaking their language, what is the reaction?
One is relief, the facial expression of relief, of recognition of someone from home. The tenseness of their body relaxes, and they're so grateful to see somebody from home. Yeah.
As I began interviewing the elders, I began hearing certain themes come up over and over again. Things that I had not heard about before, such as the 60s swoop, the forced resettlement of entire communities. But one day I was speaking to Mary Alanga, who works right here in the Ottawa parole office, and she once again referred to the 60s swoop and the sled dog slaughter. And for the first time I stopped her, and I think it was propitious that I did, because she told me a story that, again, I had never heard, and I want to share that with you.
My father's 2 dog teams were slaughtered. My father went and took his team into Frobisher Bay to get supplies. While he was getting his supplies, the RCMP shot his dog team. So after they slaughtered my father's dogs, he took his sled and he pulled it down to the camp with his supplies, and he didn't have a team anymore. The next time he went to Frobisher Bay to get supplies, his dogs got slaughtered again. And this is his second team. So he was angry because it was his second team, and so he took his rifle and he went around the community and shot all the tires of the RCMP cars. He told the RCMP that, okay, well, you have no tires, see how far you can go. And he had to walk down to our camp again to pick us up.
This is the first time I have ever heard. I'm 57 years old, raised entirely in the Canadian school system. This, among many other stories, why haven't we heard them? And why are they? And you can see, I think what struck me here was her level of emotion. That struck me. It's like, wow, it's not like this happened many generations ago. This happened to her. It happened to her father. When I was in Edmonton, I had the opportunity of interviewing a number of elders from across the country. They'd come there for the National Elders Working Group. One of the elders that I interviewed there was a fellow named George Harris, who, again, I was sort of interviewing elders one after the other, so I was like, bring them in, sit them down, started asking them questions. And I asked George about the residential schools, because, again, this is an issue, it's a topic that we've heard about. Everybody now knows about it as a result of the apology in 2008. But again, it was until this, it was for me a conceptual thing. It was like, yes, I know what happened, but it didn't really touch me. It was like sort of a historical fact, and that was it. So I'm going to show you a clip that I think was, for me, probably the turning point. I had asked him to make the link for me between the high incarceration rates of Aboriginal people and residential schools. That was the question I posed to him.
For me, when I was taken away from my village, my mom tried to protect me for as long as she could, but the authorities came down and said, if you do not let your children go, there will be legal consequences. You must let your children go. you must allow them to be taken away on that missionary boat to go to the residential school. My mom cried.
It's okay.
So did my grandmother, grandfather. My grandmother never spoke any English. All she spoke was our Halkaminam. It effectively was the start of the beginning of the breakup of our family, an attempt to break up our family. And my mom and dad being strong, and my grandmother and grandfather being strong. They didn't allow that to happen. The sad part for me, though, was at the end of 10 months of being in residential school, I came home for summer holidays. My grandmother had to reacquaint herself with me as a different person, not the same one that went in.
After this particular interview, I realized for the first time that he's not much older than me, actually. He's probably just perhaps 10 years or so. So within my lifetime, this generational pain has been occurring. And I think he answered the question more poignantly than he could have if he'd used words to describe it, because it's that pain that you can see that gets passed down. And so a lot of the elders spoke about, I think one of the biggest themes obviously was intergenerational trauma and how that works itself through the system. And so what I began to see over the course of the interviews was that, and that's actually to answer your question, how do elders become elders? How do the Aboriginal communities in general, those all of whom have been touched by this massive trauma over the course of many years, how do they rebuild their communities, and how do elders become elders when the elders that they had originally are no longer there? So many of them, like George, would have had to take the journey of working through their own pain and relearning their own teachings, their own traditions. And one of the things that came out was that because of this massive trauma that transpired over the course of decades, those traditions had been lost, those teachings had been lost, the cultural identity of the separate nations had been lost. And so that many of the offenders who are now in our institutions, they're the grandchildren of the initial survivors of residential schools. They're either the children, but mainly they're the grandchildren. And so the whole notion of grandfathers being brought into the sweats with them took on a whole new meaning, because in fact many of the elders who themselves had to work through their own pain were now literally the grandparents of the offenders who are in the institutions. I had the opportunity in Joliette, while interviewing elders, we went to visit one of the houses, and they introduced me to Sarah, who was a 23-year-old Inuit offender.
I think the violence is passing through the generation and generation to generation, because first of all, from what I think is in my life, that my grandparents and my parents had suffered from residential school, and from my grandfather being dog slaughtered from his dogs, and those kind of things that happened to my grandparents and my parents past, I think they had the anger of what happened to them and pass it along to their children and to their grandchildren. That's what I think personally. And they didn't know. I think they didn't understand how to deal with their emotions, so they had to do it to their children and to their grandchildren, and it's passing along. But at some point, they have to stop it. For me, I want to stop it in my generation. Before I have my children, I want to be able to stop the violence in my family.
It's quite profound, actually. I was quite struck by the fact that this 23-year-old, and I had the opportunity of interviewing a male, a young Aboriginal man in Beaver Creek, who also 23 years old, a dangerous offender, who he was in for double homicide, but who had made a complete turnaround and had the same insight that yes, this is a violence. They were sort of recipients of a violence that had been passed on through their parents. But that it had to stop at some point. That it had to end. And then the question becomes, how does that happen, right? How does that violence come to an end? How does a child who received violence as a child turn her life around? And the answer to that question is the elders, for one. Maybe there will be other people in their lives who can help, but elders are an integral channel through which that love and understanding comes about, that reconnectedness to their culture comes about, that reappropriation of their identity comes about. I just want to show you a clip of Gilbert Sanapas, who is an elder in Dorchester Medium. Just listen to what he says.
And sometimes I would ask the guys, what am I to you guys? Who am I to you? And where the answer that I would get from these guys, they would say, you are our father. I mean, father, what do you mean? He said, you tell us things. And you talk to us and you take time to listen to us. He said, this has been happening in our lives when we were home.
So that I thought was sort of an indication of just how important the role of the elders is. I went in again thinking, really not thinking it very deeply at all, but I came away with the very, very powerful impression that elders are integral. Like if one of the mandates of CSC is to help offenders reintegrate in a secure and safe way into their communities, that when it comes to a significant proportion of those inmates who are Aboriginal in descent, the elders are integral. They're treated like a second thought, but in fact, my feeling is they need to be taken with the utmost level of seriousness because they play such an important role for many reasons, and I'm not going to get into all of them here, but mainly because they are trusted. They quite literally, as I said earlier, are playing the role of the grandparents who have done the journey and who are leading their grandchildren back home, back to their communities.